All right, today we're putting on our detective hats and diving into the world of pediatric endocrinology. We're going to see how doctors use these tiny, subtle clues, the symptoms, to solve some really complex hormonal mysteries in kids.
So let me throw a puzzle at you. You've got a sleepy newborn, a really dehydrated infant, and a teenager who is both obese and unusually short. Now, on the surface, these things seem totally unrelated, right? But what if I told you they could all be connected by the same hidden culprit?
And there's the answer. Each one of these kids is basically sending out a distress signal from their endocrine system. Their bodies are either making way too much or way too little of a really critical hormone. The challenge, and honestly, what makes this field so cool, is learning how to read those subtle clues. Okay, so first things first, a super quick refresh on hormones. Just think of them as the body's chemical messengers. They control pretty much everything from how we grow to how we feel. When these messages get all jumbled up, that's when the clues start to pop up. So let's jump into our first case. Our first mystery is one you've probably heard of, but it's got some tricky twist when it comes to kids. We're talking about the sugar puzzle of diabetes. This whole thing boils down to the hormone that controls our blood sugar, insulin. And you know what? This could very well be the mystery behind our dehydrated infant. Okay, so here we've got our two main suspects lined up, type 1 and type 2. And you've got to pay attention to the key differences. Type 1, that's an autoimmune attack. It comes on suddenly, and the body literally destroys its own insulin-making cells. Type 2, on the other hand, is a much more gradual process of insulin resistance, where the body's making insulin, but it just can't use it right. And this brings us to a golden rule for any clinical detective. We often think of type 2 diabetes as something for older people, but in kids, the single most reliable clue is their body shape. Obesity is the #1 indicator for type 2, even more so than a strong family history. It's a huge clue. So what happens when there's no insulin to let sugar into the cells? Well, the sugar just builds up and up in the blood to really dangerous levels. This can actually trigger a life-threatening emergency, and a lot of the time, it's the very first sign that a child even has type 1 diabetes. That emergency? It's called diabetic ketoacidosis, or DKA for short, and these are its calling cards. The body is starved for sugar, so it starts burning fat like crazy, which produces ketones. This is what causes that classic fruity smell on the breath. It also causes terrible abdominal pain, so bad it can look just like appendicitis. And as the brain gets affected, the child becomes drowsy and confused. All that stress also kicks the immune system into overdrive, causing a high white blood cell count. Managing DKA is an absolute race against time, and the order you do things in is absolutely critical. Now you might think, okay, problem is no insulin, so give insulin. But nope, that's not the first step. Look here, it's fluids. You have to rehydrate the patient first with a very specific fluid, 0.9% normal saline. Insulin only starts an hour later. And why is that? Well, because starting insulin too soon can cause some really dangerous electrolyte shifts, especially in the brain. And this right here highlights the single biggest danger in treating DKA, cerebral edema, which is just a fancy term for brain swelling. If you correct the fluids or the glucose levels too fast, it can be catastrophic. That's why the monitoring has to be constant. A sudden headache or a change in mood isn't just a symptom. It's a full-blown medical emergency that needs immediate treatment with something like mannitol. Okay, our next case is even more subtle. It's the one that connects us back to that sleepy newborn from our initial puzzle. This is a silent threat that can cause permanent damage without making a single sound. We're talking about congenital hypothyroidism. So here's the first really deceptive clue in this mystery. The newborn often looks completely normal. They might even be a little bigger than average. And that's because mom's thyroid hormones crossed the placenta during pregnancy, giving the baby everything it needed and basically masking the real problem. But, and this is a huge but, the second that baby is born, that supply line from mom is cut off. And without its own thyroid hormone, the brain simply cannot develop the way it's supposed to. This is the crucial point, right here. Congenital hypothyroidism is one of the most common, treatable causes of intellectual disability. The stakes really couldn't be any higher. So what's actually causing this? Well, as you can see from this chart, in about 85% of cases, the problem is structural. The thyroid gland itself just didn't form right. It's actually much less common for the gland to be there but just not be able to produce the hormone. So how on earth do we catch this silent threat? With this simple, brilliant test, the newborn screening, or heel prick test.
They take a tiny blood sample between day 3 and 5 of life to measure something called thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. See, if the thyroid isn't working, the brain sends out more and more TSH to try and wake it up. So a really high TSH level is our telltale clue.
All right, for our final puzzles, we're taking a look at the adrenal glands. These little guys sit right on top of the kidneys, and they control our stress hormones, like cortisol and aldosterone. And this is where we're going to investigate the case of our unusually short and obese teen. Now check this out. This slide shows the classic trio of clues for a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. When an infant is in crisis, they'll have low sodium and high potassium, which could be another explanation for our dehydrated infant. But look at the most unique clue: darker skin. The body is pumping out this precursor hormone, ACTH, to try and stimulate the adrenals. And a weird side effect is that it also stimulates melanin production, making the skin dark. Okay, now let's completely flip the script. What if the problem isn't that the adrenal glands are making too little hormone, but that they're making way too much? This leads us to our final and maybe our trickiest challenge: telling the difference between a serious hormonal disorder and simple obesity. Think of this table as our detective's cheat sheet for this exact puzzle. In Cushing's syndrome, which is caused by way too much cortisol, the fat is all central. You see a rounded face, fat pads on the upper back. But the real giveaways are things you might not expect. High cortisol actually suppresses growth, making the child short, and it causes muscle weakness. In simple obesity, the child is often tall for their age, and they don't have that same kind of weakness. And this brings us to another one of those incredibly powerful golden rules. If you have a child who is obese and short, alarm bells for something like Cushing's syndrome should be going off like crazy. But if a child is obese and tall, it's much, much more likely to just be simple obesity. Height is the absolute key differentiator here. Wow, okay, we have investigated 3 major hormonal mysteries. Now, let's do a quick, rapid-fire recap of the most important detective rules we've learned along the way. Okay, you ready? Burn these into your brain. For DKA, the first fluid you give is always 0.9% normal saline, and the worst thing you're watching for is cerebral edema. For hypothyroidism, if a patient is already on treatment and their TSH is high, it probably means they're not taking their medicine. And remember, the heel prick test is the simple screen that literally saves brains. And finally, to nail the diagnosis of Cushing's syndrome, the test you need is the dexamethasone suppression test.
At the end of the day, decoding all of these hormonal puzzles really just comes down to recognizing patterns. A single clue might not mean anything, but when you see the right combination, it can reveal the whole truth. And in so many of these cases, it can literally save a life. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other invisible clues and subtle patterns are we all missing in the world around us every single day?